two pillars that hold up the Scripture above any other book that's ever been written. Prophecy, fulfilled prophecy as proof, because God said it was. And we talked about, prior to that, we talked about science and how much the Bible told us that we weren't even able to find out until just recently. Because there are scientific discoveries that it took us thousands of years after the Bible told us to find out that it was actually true.
But it's still being found.
And it's still being found.
Wow.
And today we're going to talk about another aspect of science, which is archaeology. And archaeology is defined as a scientific study of historic or prehistoric people and their cultures by analysis of their artifacts, inscriptions, monuments, and other such remains, especially those that have been excavated. So an archaeologist is the one who goes and starts digging in the ground, and as they find stuff from previous generations, previous civilizations, they very carefully bring it out, they clean it up, and then they figure out how to read it and figure out what it was and what age it came from. And so there's quite a bit of study that goes into this process. And there's archaeologists from all different points of view, too. I mean, there are a lot of Christians who go into archaeology because they are really drawn to finding some of the things that the Bible, that they've read about. And then on the other side, there's atheists that go into archaeology who are bound and determined to prove that it never happened. And so, but all cultures have them. There are a lot of Jewish archaeologists. They're really interested in their history and stuff as well. And so, you get all these together and you can get a lot of different things being written about history and about how things happened and what they were like in those days. And sometimes they agree and sometimes they disagree. But what we find is that the more that they dig, the more things that they bring up, the closer and closer and closer it becomes to showing that everything that the Bible has ever said is accurate. Sometimes you find out that claims made by certain religions don't make any sense at all once they actually start to dig things up. Mormonism is a really easy one to pick on. Because unlike some, like in the Hindu religion, in the Buddhist religion, they don't really give a whole lot of historical background to anything. It's just a collection of sayings, philosophies, almost like, just a whole lot of fortune cookie stuff that you can just put together. But yeah, but it's mostly philosophical. Not a whole lot in their books and stuff about the origin and the history of any particular group of people or whatever. Mormonism, on the other hand, Joseph Smith really liked to write, and he was a very imaginative guy. He wrote an awful lot about cities and civilizations. He kind of came up with the idea that there was a lost tribe of Israel that had somehow or other migrated to the continent of the United States, and they were the forefathers of the Indians, and that at one time they had this huge civilization that spread all across America, and they had built huge buildings and monuments, and that they had huge cities, and he named the cities, and he talked about battles that were fought between the cities. And not one single artifact has ever been found. Nothing. No cities, no coins, no weapons. Nothing has ever been found that corroborates what he said. So what it comes down to is that, just like The Lord of the Rings or any other very detailed work of fiction, that's all it is. On the other hand, we have the Bible, 66 books written well over 1,000 years of time, by various different people across a couple of different countries and areas. And so there's been plenty of time for people to go out and search for the things that have been mentioned in there historically. And so that's what we get to go through at this point to find out how true is. Because we talked about in the very first part of this that, if we are looking for evidence, then we also have to expect that God would give us some. And God actually says, Let's reason together. Let's think about these things. Don't just accept things on blind faith. That's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is always saying that He will prove things. And so, as we dig into this stuff, we start to find things. But one of the ways that we find is that there's been skeptics. And the skeptics have done an awful lot of talking and writing over the years. And a lot of times people will read some of the things that these skeptics, and some of them are very learned, they're doctors or they're scientists, and so they write a book saying that they doubt that some particular point in the Bible could possibly be true because they've been there and they've poked around and they've dug around and they never found anything. And so they come back and say, it's just not true. It's just not true. I knew it wasn't going to be true. So one of the earliest arguments that people have had against the Bible itself is that they claim that Moses could not possibly have written the first 5 books of the Bible, and they base that on an assumption that back in the day that Moses lived, there wasn't a whole lot of writing at all. They basically say that Moses lived at a time when people didn't write things down, that they just passed them on orally. And so that the only thing that was available at that time was people memorizing an oral tradition, and that it was way before the time that man actually learned how to write. And for many, many years, having never found anything that they could date back to that era, they thought they were right. And then all of a sudden, archaeology proved otherwise, because they discovered not just one example of it, but 3 huge examples of writings that predated Moses. And not that Moses was ever, the Bible never says Moses was the first one that wrote something down. The Bible just acts like that writing was something that people did. Well, we find out it definitely was, because many years before Moses, codes and laws and lists of genealogies and so forth were being written by all the cultures in that time. And so basically what we find is that our modern scientists just simply assumed that because people lived in a time, a long time in the past, they must be less intelligent than we are, so they couldn't write. And that's one of the things that you have to be very careful of, is making an assumption that people have somehow gotten smarter as time has gone by. And that is definitely not the case. Because the thing about it is, if you think about it, sometimes you have to be a lot smarter to do with less than to do with more. And what I mean by that is, when we have all kinds of little gadgets that somebody made that does a lot of our tasks for us, it makes it a lot harder for us to actually think about it, because we're not used to doing that. It's just like the kids that come into class, they can't add without a calculator. When I went to school, if we pulled out a calculator for a test, what would happen?
Cheating.
That's cheating. Zero, exactly. But now, we're supposed to tell them, bring your calculator because you're going to need it. So, and what about the people that, all these formulas, these math formulas and stuff that we use, that everybody, the kids all come in, they have their little sheet that has all the formulas already written down. Well, what about the guys that invented those formulas? Some of those are from 1,000 years ago. Some of them are from Aristotle. That he came up, and he did that without a computer, without a calculator, without even an erasable pencil. He did that by, he came up with these mathematical formulas, back in the ancient times. So, assuming that people who lived a long time ago were somehow less intelligent is a really bad mistake. So, we're going to talk about the Ebla tablets. Ebla was a civilization, a town that they found, and it was discovered or uncovered by the archaeologists in 1977. And they found over 1,800 complete clay tablets and 4,700 fragments of other tablets, thousands of minor chips, all containing very, very intricate written language. And these were in the country of Syria. And one of the things that is very, very disheartening today is with all the fighting that's going on over there, all of these things are being destroyed.
Yes.
And ISIS, one of their missions is to destroy everything that they can find.
Yes.
Every ancient artifact, every ancient monument, everything that they can find, they want to erase it unless it agrees with them.
Yeah.
So they want to erase every hint of any other religion or civilization off the face of the earth. And they are doing it every day. They're finding more stuff and blowing it up. But we know at this point it's been studied, and they dated it back to 2500 BC. But
Wow.
these are some of the pictures that we have, and they've been in the museum there for many, many years. But it's a very, very intricate. You know, they had a system of writing, and they recorded many, many things, including the lineage of all their kings, and the laws that they lived by, and basically some of it is almost just like newspaper type stuff. Events that have happened, things that the neighbors did, you know. They had a very, very intricate system of writing. So that first claim that Moses couldn't have possibly written all this down because there was no writing is obviously false. This is just a picture of one of the areas that got uncovered, and just like a lot of archaeology, sometimes the first time they find it is by accident.
Yeah.
It's by somebody who decides to go out and dig a well, or somebody that goes out and decides to clear off some land to build something, and in the process they uncover something really impressive. So this was the case here, you know, that they all of a sudden they unearthed all of these tablets in what at one time had been an ancient library. So, you know, we're going to get into just a couple of you know, very specific things that skeptics have talked about. One of them was that there's a Hebrew or Aramaic word called tehom. And that's the word that's translated into English, the deep, in the very first chapter of Genesis, when it says the Spirit of God moved over the deep. And they said that word was what they considered to be a late word. In other words, it was a word that hadn't even come into existence in the time of the writing of Genesis, or at least in the time that most biblical scholars say that Genesis was written. And they say that word wasn't found in any other writings of that time. It wasn't found for maybe 1,000 years later that word started to be used by other civilizations around them. And so they, by saying that, they said that, well, it wasn't. But when they uncovered those tablets in Ebla, they found the word tehom was used all the time, repeatedly, in those clay tablets, and they were written 800 years before Moses. So once again, proof that their skepticism was unfounded. Another thing that people were skeptical of was the name Canaan. That's the word that the Bible used in the book of Genesis to describe the promised land. When God told Abraham to move into the land, he told him to go into the land of Canaan and to possess it. But once again, they said that word was incorrect. That kind of proved the Bible was inaccurate, because nobody in that region called it Canaan. But once again, once they read those tablets that they found at Ebla, guess what? Guess what they called that area? Canaan. And so once again, it proved that, no, this wasn't some invention of the Bible. It was actually what the ancient people had called that area for at least 1,000 years before it showed up in the Bible. So there was nothing inaccurate about the writings in the book of Genesis. Another one, that I think I mentioned this before, there were several prominent archaeologists and historians who said there was never a group called the Hittites. This group never existed. We have been all over the ancient Middle East. We have never found anything. No people have ever written about the Hittites. No one has ever said anything about them. They just simply don't exist. And so they started saying that the Bible had just created a myth, that this didn't work. But accidentally, somebody dug up something. It turned out to be an entire city, and they found the Hittite capital in Turkey. And so once again, proven. And see, they always talked. The Bible always talked about that the Hittites invaded from the north. Where is Turkey? Is north of Israel. So that, once again, exactly what they had always said. The other thing was that the Bible spends a lot of time talking about how much money, how much gold, and how much land, and how many, fine jewels and everything that Solomon had, and that he had been given. And they said, oh, that's an exaggeration. Nobody in that time period had that much wealth. Well, as they'd gone back, they found that almost every king in that time period had that much wealth. Or at least enough of it to make it seem like that it wouldn't be unreasonable for Solomon to be considered the richest man in the world at that time. Because, and when you listen to the groups of people, because when it talks about Solomon, it talks about, kings and queens coming from as far as Africa to meet with him because of his, he was a famous man because of his wisdom. So people came, and everyone that came gave him a tribute of, and sometimes it listed, hundreds of barrels of gold or some, things that they would come and bring to him. So, once again, as the more they studied, the more they found out that it was definitely possible. Another thing that people claimed was that there was no such thing as an Assyrian king named Sargon, because they hadn't found it. And, the Bible only talks about him, in a very few places. So they said, well, somebody made a mistake here. There couldn't possibly be this guy because we haven't found anything about him. And then all of a sudden, right in the middle of Iraq, they find his palace with his name written and carved all over it, statues of him with his name carved on it, and the very event that Isaiah chapter 20 talks about was carved into the wall of his palace as one of his great achievements. So once again, the Bible, 100, archaeologists or scientists 0 when they try to go against it. And, it just, there's no possible way we could go through everything that has been discovered because, these discoveries have been made over and over again and in fact are continuing to be. But I think it's really fun to talk about some of these things because it's just like the flood. So many people argue with the flood and Noah and how could that possibly happen? How could God get one of every species of animals on the ark? And people make fun of it. Oh, you believe in that? That's just a fairy tale. That's silly. But everything that we look at shows a world that has been affected by a flood. And it's funny because I was looking on Facebook yesterday and somebody posted a thing that they just uncovered in the middle of the Sahara Desert, the absolute driest place on the planet, that they just uncovered over 10 complete skeletons of extinct whales in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And they said, wow, this place must have been covered by water at some time. Yeah. Yes, it was. Well, of course, the people, the scientists working on it, their claim is, well, it had to have been 50 million years ago because, there's just no way it was, because we've just never seen that happen. Well, we know what happened. It's not hard to tell. But it's just fun to keep your eye open for stuff like that because, you'll find stuff, and even if the article is not written from a Christian perspective, you look at it and go, yeah, there's another proof that something like that happened. It's just like there's another story that I read a couple years ago, that there's islands in the Pacific that have these huge granite boulders, just sitting in the middle, or just kind of piled randomly around. And they can't figure out where they could possibly come from. They baffled scientists for years because there's no rocks like that anywhere on the island. The islands are all volcanic. There's no granite anywhere around. So how could these huge granite boulders, I mean some of them bigger than this house, have ended up on this island? Well, a Christian scientist looked at it and said, well, that's really simple. He went to the North Pole and Alaska and matched the granite. Exactly. It's exactly where it came from. And he said, there's always been an ice cap on there, but if the world is flooded and the water is high enough, those icebergs can float anywhere they want. And as that ice forms around the rocks and the water rises, guess what? The ice picks up the rocks and they float away. And so all of a sudden, you have a very reasonable explanation for how rocks ended up somewhere that they don't exist. But anyway, that one of the things that they've discovered is that the Bible is not the only place where this flood is documented. The Samaritan, or the Sumerian, another Persian group, when they uncovered some of their writings, they found a list of kings. And in this list of kings, there was a very, very interesting part of it that talked about that they had a list of kings before a flood and a list of kings after the flood. And the very interesting thing was that the ones before the flood lived much, much longer than the ones after the flood. And we look at that, the Bible has said that for years, that all of the people who lived before the flood lived 800 or 900 years. And after the flood, all of a sudden, their lifespans drastically reduced. Big time. Big time. And there's a scientific reason for that too. Because if you look at the Bible, according to the Bible, it had never ever rained before the flood. Which meant that all of the water in the atmosphere was held above the earth and never fell. And that much water in the atmosphere would block the radiation from the sun way more than the atmosphere that we have today. And so anything living on Earth at that time would have much less radiation hitting them on a daily basis. And that is one of the things that determines our lifespan.
Wow.
Which also explains why there were huge animals like the dinosaurs and these huge lizards, because reptiles grow their entire life. They never stop growing. The older an alligator is, the bigger it is. And if for some reason you could keep one alive for another 50 years, it would continue to grow. Now think about how big it would get if it grew 100 years or 200 years. So, this is one of the things that once again agrees with what the Bible has always told us. This is a graph that we have just talking about the years of some of the people in the early genealogies of the Bible. That's Adam at the top. He lived over 900 years.
Wow.
Now the interesting thing is, you can see where Noah at the bottom, where he was born, Adam lived almost to the point of Noah's birth. And many of the sons of Adam and the other people from all the way back almost to the beginning were still alive when God came to Noah and said he was going to destroy the earth. So these are people who lived almost back to the time. And the one thing, they definitely, every single one of these people were contemporaries of Adam. They all knew intimately the story of men getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So I think that's really an interesting thing, because when Noah came along, in fact Methuselah lived until just about 10 years before God destroyed the earth.
Wow.
He died right before it happened. But he had been around for a long, long time prior to that. Which makes it really interesting because you start to think, these people knew Adam. They knew, all about the story of how they ended up there, and yet they were unable, or even part of the problem when God said that the earth had become so evil it needed to be destroyed. That means these people that have been living all that time to know what they had lost were actually possibly part of, they definitely weren't able to turn things around, and some of them were even considered to be part of the problem. This just shows the big decline if you look at the names of people of how long they lived, and then all of a sudden you see the dramatic drop off. Yep. And you see Noah, he was the last one that lived. Him and Shem were the last one that lived that long, but of course they had lived most of their life prior to the flood. The other things that have popped up that they found archaeology is that the Sumerian, those same tablets that recorded the flood, they also record the Tower of Babel issue, the fact that at one time everybody spoke the same language, and then all of a sudden for some reason the languages were confused and people split up. They also talk about a golden age when everybody worked together and all that kind of stuff. And the Babylonians also, their culture also had a written account of that same thing. And so it wasn't something that just the Bible talked about. But all the ancient, the big ancient cultures remembered it and talked about the same thing.
Recorded it.
Yeah, they recorded it as well. Now the funny thing is that the Babylonians, I find this really interesting and almost a little funny, if it weren't sad, but the Babylonians actually recorded their record of the flood is in a story that they write about one of their ancient heroes. And in the story, he climbs a mountain called Ararat to fight with the flood god. And supposedly, according to the Babylonians, he defeated him and came back and became one of their gods. But, so in their, they basically what the story shows is that afterwards they were angry with the God who flooded the world. They looked at him as an evil God, as a bad God for what he did, because he took away something from them. So, and the thing about it is, it talks about, if you read the Bible, it talks about that not all of Noah's sons were happy or did what God told them to do. And when they went out and went on their own way, not all of them continued to follow God. And so you have some of them you have descendants from some of those writing these stories about how this mean, awful, evil God flooded the world. And they had to send a hero up to try to deal with it. Let's move into the New Testament just a little bit here. So right now, this is our archaeologists, all of them put together, have found 4 historical sources that give us every single bit of information that we have about Julius Caesar. Who's heard of Julius Caesar before? Studied him in school, seen movies about him, all that kind of stuff. Does anybody doubt that at one time in the Roman Empire there was a guy named Julius Caesar? No? It's taught in every history class. There's only 4 sources that mention Julius Caesar ever lived. Historically, there's only 4 contemporary archaeologically discovered sources that ever mention him. There's 26 outside of the Bible that tell about Jesus, and yet there's every day you'll run into somebody, if you're in a college campus or something, who says, "We don't even believe Jesus ever lived." The evidence speaks, you know. If you ask them, do you believe in Julius Caesar? Well, of course.
Wow. 26 and they still don't believe.
This is an interesting. This is one of the things of the New Testament that the skeptics always talked about. They said that you know, we know who Pontius Pilate is. You read about him all through the Bible, especially when it comes to the trial of Jesus. And even though his name was found in writings by Josephus and Tacitus, who were both first century authors, they're still skeptical that he ever existed because they had never found anything with his name carved on it. No buildings, no thrones, no monuments, no gravestone, nothing. They, you know, and for many, many years, people had looked for that, but never found it. But in 1961, that all changed because they found it. The Pilate inscription. It's a stone slab that documents that he was the Roman official that governed Judea. And they, you know, they finally found it. Now the thing about it is, where did he govern? What city was Pontius Pilate in?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. What happened to Jerusalem?
Got destroyed.
It got destroyed by who?
The Romans.
The Romans, his own people. You know, you know. So he packed up and moved out. The Romans came back and leveled it, burned it, destroyed it. So he really didn't have any monuments made to it. You know, and you know the thing about it is when you look at it historically, he was looked at by the Romans as a failure because he failed to keep the Jews quiet and underfoot. They had to go in and eradicate them because they wouldn't stop fighting.
They found this in Jerusalem.
So, but with all the archaeology that was done, finally in 1961 they found him. And since then, there's been several other things that they found that also have his name. But, you know, he wasn't the kind of a guy that they would have built great monuments to because the Romans considered him to be a failure.
Yeah.
The Jews hated him because he was the one that lorded it over them. The Christians considered that he did what? You know, are the Christians going to build monuments to Pontius Pilate? No. You know, so he was the one that ordered Jesus crucified. So he really didn't go down in history as somebody that was going to be remembered very much, you know. But there it is. The other thing that that was disbelieved for many years, and that is the fact that a lot of skeptics, looking back through historical Roman documents and stuff, argued with the way the Bible talked about Jesus' crucifixion. They said that it was believed that most people who were crucified were never nailed to the cross. They were simply tied up to the cross and left there until they died. And secondly, they talked about the fact that victims, or people that were crucified, they were criminals. They were never buried in a tomb or given a good burial. They were usually just thrown in a big pit with 100 other people and covered over. And so they said, it just doesn't make sense. They didn't nail people to a cross. They didn't do this. They didn't bury them like Jesus was buried. And then in 1968, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, but an archaeologist found the remains of a crucifixion victim named Johannan, and he had spikes driven in both feet and nails driven between the lower bones of each arm in the wrist, and he appeared to have had his legs broken, which is exactly what the Bible says that they were coming to do. And in addition to this, he was buried in his own grave, and he looked, when they found him, he had been taken care of according to the traditions of the time. And so it proves that, first of all, they did crucify people by nailing them to a cross in certain cases, and that if somebody came and asked them to, asked to bury him, then they would grant that as well. So, yeah, and the thing about it is, the Bible really speaks to that, just like you said, because they had to go to Pilate and petition him. They had to formally ask him for Jesus' body, because if they hadn't, he would have just been thrown in in a pit with others. but they had to go in and petition, and they had to get, basically call in a favor to get his body. But, I think in the particular case, since the Bible says Pilate was not really in favor of crucifying him in the first place, he didn't argue with them too much about that. So, another thing that people say is that the book Luke got it wrong in Acts when he talks about Iconium being a city in the state or country of Phrygia. And many archaeologists says that this was a huge mistake, that there was no evidence of that city at all, and they believe that Lystra and Derbe were in Phrygia, but they concluded that Iconium wasn't, because there were some writings, such as Cicero, who said that Iconium was in another country. Until they found a monument that showed that it was, in fact, a city and the exact location of it. So they've uncovered now that city and found that it was Cicero, who was a Roman writer a couple hundred years later, but he was the one that made the mistake, not Luke. This is another one. They said Luke made another huge mistake because he uses this word politarchs. And it's a Greek word that's supposed to mean the rulers of the city, but they said that they couldn't find any example of that term anywhere else. But of course, since they wrote, one of the archaeologists had even written a book about that particular thing, saying that was a made-up word, it wasn't true, and that was cause to doubt the whole Bible. Since then, there's been 19 inscriptions found that use that title, and 5 of those are in reference to Thessalonica, and that's exactly what Luke was talking about when he used that term. So once again, the Bible was accurate. There's an archaeologist named Dr. Habermas who points out that within 110 years of Christ's crucifixion, 18 non-Christian sources mention more than 100 facts, beliefs, and teachings from the life of Christ and early Christians. These items, I might add, mention that almost every major detail of Jesus' life, including the miracles, the resurrection, and his claims of being God. So the 18 sources that are outside the Bible that verify that those claims were being made and that the people that this is exactly what the people believed in. You see, there's a whole lot of historians and scientists out there, and you can find a lot of them on those History Channel programs about the Bible that sit around and say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, and the Bible was written many, many years after he existed, probably by the Catholic Church 400 or 500 years after Christ, and all of the things that we believe about him today from the Bible were just made up by them, and none of the people who lived in in that time ever thought that all of these things are just added on many, many hundreds of years later. But there's 18 sources from the time of Christ in the first century that agree with everything that's written in the Bible from those times. Is when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were by a sect of Jews who were basically kind of at war with the leading Pharisees and Sadducees over the way that they should practice their religion. They were also very zealous. They were part of the problem to Rome because they were one of the groups that refused to stop fighting. They lived out away from the city in caves, and they had communities out there, the ones that built the Masada complex, which was the last place that the Romans had to track them down and fight them. But, one of the things that they did, they were very diligent in copying the Old Testament scriptures. And that was, they had scribes that just worked round the clock on making copies and copies and copies of all the Old Testament books, but they particularly liked the prophets. And so they had tons of copies. So when they found this cave full of these jars that had the Dead Sea Scrolls in them, that's what they found, was almost perfect copies. The other thing that was interesting is that community when they sealed all that stuff in the caves, they did that because they knew the Romans were coming, which means that they did that all sometime before 65 AD, because the Roman emperor invaded with his army in late 65 AD and surrounded Jerusalem in 68. Remember, we talked about that, and then he was called back when the emperor was actually killed. Titus had to go back, and then he sent his son back with the army to finally destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD. But they had gone out into the hills hunting these people down, and so they had sealed all of their documents and everything away to keep the Romans from burning them. When they found it and when they opened these up, the one very interesting thing, and all of these, it's in Israel. Most of the scientists and archaeologists that found this are Jewish, not Christian. And so the one little fact that they've kind of kept just hush-hush is the fact that when they dug these out, they found 27 or 28 little fragments of parchment paper that was different from the paper or these writings of the Old Testament. And they realized that they had partial Greek writing on them. And of course all the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in Aramaic. But these little parchment pieces that they found were all written in Greek. And they said, well, we don't have any idea what those could have been. Well, as other scientists and archaeologists and people that deal with this kind of stuff are reading ancient fragments, put them into their computer, they found that they had parchments, that they had pieces of almost every single book of the New Testament were in there as well, which disproves the whole idea that all of this was written so far after the fact, because they were sealed in there before 65 AD. And then also, there's even a lot of Christian scholars that try to push some of the writings of, like, the Book of Revelation into the late 90s, and therefore try to say that all the things that he wrote in there couldn't have been about some contemporary things that were happening at the time. But if they were put in, if they already had copies of the New Testament as well, sealed in those caves before 65 AD, that changes a lot about what we think about the Scripture. And the funny thing was that they also found in there commentaries that some of their rabbis had written, and their commentaries said the Messiah that they were expecting was one exactly like Jesus.
So they probably, that's admitted that they missed it. That's why we haven't heard.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that they were much more open, and they mentioned Jesus, and they mentioned him in a much more positive way than the writings from Jerusalem and stuff did. They were, in fact, some of the writings that they had were very, very, condemning of the Jews who had killed him, because they said, you've probably killed the Messiah.
Yeah.
Another great archaeologist, Sir William Ramsay, demonstrated that Luke had made absolutely no mistakes in his references to 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands. And the liberal scholars used to argue that a town named Nazareth didn't exist at the time of Jesus until they unearthed it. The Gospel's portrayal of the temple, Pilate's court, Jesus' crown of thorns, and the mode of his execution have also all been confirmed. This is writings from Josephus, who wrote about 80 AD. He was one of the, we talked about him before, but he was a Jew who was in Caesar's court and who traveled with the army as the historian to record what was happening when the Roman army went into Israel. And, he was considered by the Jews to be a traitor because he had signed on with the Romans and become a court historian. But this is what he had to say. He said, now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him who was a good man and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism. So here is a Roman historian giving us a complete verification that Herod killed John the Baptist and what John the Baptist was like. And it totally agrees with the version we have in the Bible. Here's some more things that Josephus said. He said, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law. But as for the high priest Ananias, he increased in glory every day, and to a great degree, and had obtained the favor and esteem of the citizen in a signal manner, for he was a great hoarder of money. Now, here's once again somebody outside writing in history that mentions many of the same people that the Bible does. So it lines right up, and the fact is that we also know that James was put on trial and eventually killed by the Jews for the church that he ran in Jerusalem. And the Bible also mentions Ananias and his love of money as well. So, Liz, you want to do this one?
Sure. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jew and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold these things, 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day.
Wow.
So I say that lines up. And the funny thing is, Josephus never claimed to be a Christian. He just wrote about it. In his narrative of the burning of Rome, Nero fastened the guilt of and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, but the first source of the evil, but even here in Rome. So here's Tacitus, another Roman historian who lived from 55 to 117, writing about the same facts that the Bible talks about. That Pontius Pilate was the one involved in his crucifixion, that the people believed in him, that it spread all the way into Rome, and that Nero took up killing Christians. All of those things that the Bible talks about. Here's another historian who obviously doesn't believe, who obviously doesn't like Christians. He uses really negative, horrible, adjectives and stuff about them. But the fact is that he's proving, just by writing about them, that they are doing exactly what the Bible said. So sometimes negative publicity is still publicity, It's just like some politicians, they don't care if they do something stupid. If their name gets in the paper, that's good. All right, somebody else want to read the top one?
On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rock were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down.
So this is another historian, Thallus, reporting on the earthquake and the darkness that happened when what? At the crucifixion. Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
And of course, here's the Bible verses that talk about that exact same thing.
Luke 23, 44 and 45. And it was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, the sun being obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. Matthew 27, 54. Now the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God."
Jay, you want to try this one?
What advantage did the Athenians, I guess it's pronounced,
Athenians.
Athenians, yeah.
Athenians gain from putting Socrates
Mhm.
to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that the kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these. The Athenians died of hunger, the Jews ruined and driven from their land, live in complete live in complete dispersion.
Yeah. In other words, they were scattered.
Wow.
So this is another historian around 90 AD. So right there in the same time period, talking about the same thing. Hmm?
I was just saying the name.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The deeds of our Savior were always before you, for they were true miracles. Those that were healed, those that were raised from the dead, who were seen, not only when healed and when raised, but when were always present. They remained living a long time, not only whilst our Lord was on earth, but likewise when he had left the earth, so that some of them have also lived to their own times.
To our own time.
To our own time, sorry.
Yeah. So this is the court historian for Emperor Hadrian, who was writing to him, explaining about Christ and telling him that, hey, the people that Jesus healed and raised from the dead, some of them have been alive up until the last couple years. There's people here in this court that know some of them. This is not a mystery. We've been around, you know, that's overlapped. We know people who knew Jesus. People who were actually raised from the dead by him. They're still walking around, or they were until just recently. Because you know, that's like that little girl, you know, the little girl he raised, you know, if that was 30, 31, 32 AD, you know, if she was 8 or 9 years old, if she lived to be 80 or 90 years old, she would have been well into the, you know, into the 2nd century at that point.
Yeah.
And probably, you know, I would say if you're healed by Jesus directly, you're probably one of the healthiest people on earth. You're going to live a while. You know? So. You want to read this one, Liz?
Now there's a village in the land of the Jews, 35 stadia from Jerusalem, in which Jesus Christ was born. As you can ascertain also from the register of the taxing made under Cyrenius, your first procurator in Judea.
Yeah.
Justin Martyr.
So Justin Martyr is actually saying that they still had the tax records showing Jesus' birth in his time. Those tax records, the registers were still available. They were still there. They still had them on file. So the external and internal evidence tests do not prove that the Bible is inspired. In fact, you know, the fact that we have all of this archaeological stuff, that's not proof that God inspired the Bible. What it is proof, though, is that the historical record of the Bible is accurate. Now you combine that with the fact that we have these other pillars that hold it up, the scientific evidence that not a single person on earth could have known. You know, the things that at the bottom of the ocean, things out in space you can't see without a telescope. The fact that God has proven it by giving prophecies that were fulfilled to the letter hundreds of years later. You add all of that together and all it does is just become one more very large support for the Bible. You know, so, you know, it would be hard to imagine that God gave us this work, the Bible, but none of the historical stuff was actually true. That just wouldn't gel. But the fact is that it does.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we learn, the more we find out that it is. Archaeologist Joseph Free said this: archaeology has confirmed countless Bible passages which had been rejected by critics as unhistorical or contrary to known facts. And renowned Jewish archaeologist Nelson Glueck said, It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible.